All right. So we're reading A Court of Thorns and Roses. Akotar. Should be fun. We are on chapter 18. If you guys would like to stay updated on our readings, !react in the chat. All the videos get uploaded there, all the reading videos. So if you ever miss a chapter or whatever, you can always check it out on the YouTube, all right? There's a playlist for it. So, quick little recap on what happened, in case you guys missed it. But, basically, so Feyre ended up getting rescued by Tomlin. She ended up catching a serial, got some information from them, and got ambushed by, I think, 4 or 3 Nagas, and then Tomlin came to rescue. Feyre killed like 2 of them, but Tomlin needed to come to save her. And after that, there was a random fairy who got found and rescued, and their wings got ripped off, and Feyre had to witness it and felt really bad and apologized, and also apologized for the killing of the first fairy she did on the wolf, and she kind of like started turning a new leaf, and she's actually not being an asshole anymore. So I think it's good stuff is happening. Character development arc for Feyre, in my opinion. So that's where we left off. All right, so and basically, Feyre also realized that their family's taken care of, and doesn't have to worry about the family anymore, and now wants to kind of explore her interests, which is painting. And Tomlin's like, oh, I can show you the gallery at one point, you know? And, yeah, we're on chapter 18. So, yeah. Okay. All right. The next day, the blood of the fairy had been cleaned up by the time I ate, washed, and dressed. I'd taken my time in the morning, and it was nearly noon as I stood atop the staircase, peering down at the entry hall below, just to make sure it was gone. I've been set on finding Tomlin and truly explaining how sorry I was about Andres. If I was supposed to stay with him, then I could at least attempt to repair what I'd ruined. I glanced at the large window behind me, the view so sweeping that I could see all the way to the reflecting pool beyond the garden. The water was still enough that the vibrant sky and the fat, puffy clouds above were flawlessly reflected. Asking about them seemed vulgar after last night, but maybe once those paints and brushes did arrive, I could venture to the pool to capture it. I might have remained staring out towards the smear of color and light texture that Tomlin and Lucian not emerged from another wing of the manor, discussing some border patrol or another. They fell silent as I came down the stairs, and Lucian strode right out of the front door without so much as a good morning, just a casual wave. Not a vicious gesture, but he clearly had no intention of joining the conversation that Tomlin and I were about to have. I glanced around, hoping for any sign of those paints, but Tom pointed to the open doors through which Lucian had exited. Beyond them, I could see both of our horses, already saddled and waiting. Lucian was already climbing into the saddle on a third horse. I turned to Tomlin. Stay with him. He will keep me safe, and things will be better. Fine, I could do that. Where are we going? My words were half mumbled. Your supplies won't arrive until tomorrow, and the gallery's being cleaned, and my meeting was postponed. Was he rambling? I thought we'd go for a ride. No killing involved, or Naga to worry about. Even as he finished with a half smile, sorrow flickering in his eyes. Indeed, I had enough death in the past 2 days. Enough of killing fairies. Killing anything. No weapons were sheathed at his side or on his baldric, but a knife hilt glinted at his boot. Where had he buried that fairy? A high lord digging a grave for a stranger. I might not have believed it if it had been told. Might not have believed it if it hadn't been offered me a sanctuary rather than death. Where to? I asked. He only smiled. I couldn't come up with any words when we arrived, and knew that even if I hadn't been able to paint it, nothing would have done it justice. It wasn't simply that it was the most beautiful place I'd ever been to, or that it filled me with both longing and mirth, but it just seemed right, as if the colors and lights and patterns of the world had come together to form one perfect place, one true bit of beauty. After last night, it was exactly what I needed. We sat atop of a grassy knoll, overlooking a glade of oaks so wide and high they could have been the pillars and spires of an ancient castle. Shimmering tufts of dandelion fluff drifted by, and the floor of the clearing was carpeted with swaying crocuses, and snowdrops and bluebells. It was an hour or two past noon by the time we arrived, but the light was thick and golden. Though the three of us were alone, I could have sworn I heard swinging. Wait, what? Sorry, I'm like tripping on words right now. I'm a bit tired. Though the three of us were alone, I could have sworn I heard singing. I hugged my knees and drank in the glen. We brought a blanket, Tomlin said, and I looked over the shoulder to see him jerk his chin to the purple blanket they'd laid out a few feet away. Lucian plopped down onto it and stretched his legs. Tomlin remained standing, waiting for my response. I shook my head and faced forward, tracing my hand through the feather-soft grass, cataloging its color and texture. I'd never felt grass like it, and I certainly wasn't going to ruin the experience by sitting on a blanket. Rushed whispers were exchanged behind me, and before I could turn around to investigate, Tomlin took a seat at my side. His jaw was clenched tight enough that I stared ahead. "What is this place?" I said, still running my fingers through the grass. Out of the corner of my eye, Tomlin was no more than a glittering golden figure. "Just the glen." Behind us, Lucian snorted. "Do you like it?" Tomlin asked quietly. The green of his eyes matched the grass between my fingers, and the amber flecks were like the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the trees. Even his mask, odd and foreign, seemed to fit into the glen, as if this place had been fashioned for him alone. I could picture him in his beast form, curled up in the grass, dozing. "What?" I said, forgotten his question. "Do you like it?" he repeated, and his lips tugged into a smile. I took an uneven breath and stared at the glen ahead. "Yeah," he chuckled. "That's it? Yeah? Would you like me to grovel with gratitude for bringing me here, High Lord?" "Ah, the cereal told you nothing important, did it?" That smile of his sparked something bold in my chest. "He also said that you like being brushed, and if I'm a clever girl, I might train you with treats." Tomlin tipped his head to the sky and roared with laughter. Despite myself, I let out a soft laugh. "I might die of surprise," Lucian said behind me. "You made a joke, Feyre." I turned to look at him with a cool smile. "You don't want to know what the cereal said about you." I flicked my brows up, and Lucian lifted his hands in defeat. "I paid good money to hear what the cereal thinks of Lucian," Tomlin said. A cork popped, followed by the sound of Lucian chugging the bottle's contents and chuckling like a muttered, "brushed." Tomlin's eyes were still bright with laughter as he put a hand on my elbow, pulling me to my feet. "Come on," he said, jerking his head down the hill to the little stream that ran along its base. "I want to show you something." I got to my feet, but Lucian remains seated on the blanket and lifted the bottle of wine in salute. He took a slug from it as he sprawled on his back and gazed at the green canopy. Each of Tomlin's movements was precise and efficient, his powerfully muscled legs eaten up the earth as we wove between the towering trees, hopped over tiny brooks, and clambered up steep knolls. We stopped at the top of a mound, and my hands slackened at my sides. There, in a clearing surrounding by the towering trees, lay a sparkling silver pool. Even from a distance, I could tell that it wasn't water, but something more rare and infinitely more precious. Tomlin grasped my wrist and tugged me down the hill. His calloused fingers gently scraping against my skin, he let go of me to leap over the root of the tree in a single maneuver and prowl to the water's edge. I could only grind my teeth as I stumbled after him, heaving myself over the roots. He crouched by the pool and cupped his hands to fill it. He tilted his hand, letting the water fall. "Have a look." The silvery sparkling water that dribbled from his hands set ripples dancing across the pool, each glimmering with various colors, and That looks like starlight, I breathed. He huffed a laugh, filling and emptying his hands again. I gaped at the glittering water. It is starlight. That's impossible, I said, fighting the urge to take a step towards the water. This is Prithian. According to your legends, nothing's impossible. How? I asked, unable to take my eyes from the pool. The silver, but also the blue and red and pink and yellow glittering beneath. The lightness of it. I don't know. I never asked, and no one's ever explained. When I continued gaping at the pool, he laughed, drawing away my attention, only for me to find him unbuttoning his tunic. Jump in, he said, the invitation dancing in his eyes. A swim, unclothed, alone? With a High Lord? I shook my head, falling back a step. His fingers paused at the second button from his collar. Don't you want to know what it's like? I didn't know what he meant. Swimming in starlight or swimming with him? No. All right. He left his tunic unbuttoned. There was only bare, muscled, golden skin beneath. Why this place? I asked, tearing my eyes away from his chest. This was my favorite haunt as a boy. Which was when I couldn't stop the question from coming out. He cut a glance in my direction a very long time ago. He said it was so quietly that it made me shift on my feet. A very long time indeed. If he'd been a boy during the war, well, I started down that road, so I ventured to ask, is Lucian all right? After last night, I mean. He seemed back to his usual stride, irreverent self, but he vomited at the sight of that dying fairy. He didn't react well. Talman shrugged, but his words were soft as he said, Lucian has endured things that make times like Lucian has endured things that make times like last night difficult. Not just the scar in the eye, though I bet last night brought back memories of that too. Talman rubbed at his neck, then met my stare, such an ancient heaviness in his eyes and the set of his jaw. Lucian is the youngest son of the High Lord of the Autumn Court. Ooh. I straightened. The youngest of 7 brothers. The Autumn Court is cutthroat, beautiful, but his brothers see each other only as competition, since the strongest of them will inherit the title, not the eldest. It is the same throughout Prithian, at every court. Lucian never cared about it, never expected to be crowned High Lord, so he spent his youth doing everything a High Lord's son probably shouldn't. Wandering the courts, making friends with the sons of other High Lords, a faint gleam in Talman's eyes at that, and being with females who were a far cry from the nobility of the Autumn Court. Talman paused for a moment, and I couldn't almost feel the sorrow before he said, Lucian fell in love with a fairy, whom his father considered to be grossly inappropriate for someone of his bloodline. Lucian said he didn't care that she was one of the High Fae, that she was certain the mating bond would snap into place soon, and he was going to marry her and leave his father's court to his scheming brothers. A tight sigh. His father had her put down, executed in front of Lucian, and as his 2 eldest brothers held him and made him watch. My stomach turned, and I pushed a hand against my chest. I couldn't comprehend this sort of loss. Lucian left. He cursed his father, abandoned his title and the Autumn Court, and walked out, and without his title protecting him. His brothers thought to eliminate one more contender on the High Lord's crown. 3 of them went out to kill him. 1 came back. Lucian killed them? He killed 1, Thomas said. I killed the other, as they had crossed into my territory, and I was now High Lord and could do what I wanted, with trespassers threatening the peace of my lands. A cold, brutal statement. I claimed Lucian as my own, named him emissary, since he had already made many friends across the courts, and had always been good at talking to people, while I can find it difficult. He's been here ever since. As emissary, I began. Has he ever had dealings with his father or his brothers? Yeah, his father has never apologized, and his brothers are too frightened of me to risk harming them. No arrogance in those words, just icy truth. But has he ever forgotten what they did to her? Or what his brothers tried to do to him? Even if he pretends that he has. It didn't quite excuse everything Lucian had said and done to me, but I understand now. I could understand the walls and barriers he had no doubt constructed around himself. My chest was too tight, too small to fit the ache building to it. I looked at the pool and glittering starlight and let out a heavy breath. I needed to change the subject. What would happen if I drank the water? Tomlin straightened a bit, then relaxed, as if glad to release that old sadness. Legends claim that you'd be happy until your last breath, he added. Perhaps we both need a glass. I don't think the entire pool would be enough for me, I said, and he laughed. 2 jokes in one day. A miracle set from the cauldron, he said. I cracked a smile. He came a step closer, as if forcibly leaving behind the dark, sad stain of what happened to Lucian, and the starlight danced in his eyes as he said, "What would be enough to make you happy?" I blushed from my neck to the top of my head. I don't know. It was true. I'd never given that sort of thought, or thing any thought, beyond getting my sister safely married off and having enough food for me and my father, and time to learn to paint. He said, not stepping away. What about the ringing of blue bells, or a ribbon of sunshine, or a garland of moonlight? He grinned wickedly. High Lord of Prithian indeed. High Lord of Foolery was more like it. And he knew I'd say no, that I'd squirm a bit for merely being alone with him. No, I wouldn't let him have that satisfaction of embarrassing me. I had enough of that lately, enough of that girl encased in ice and bitterness, so I gave him a sweet smile, doing my best to pretend that my stomach wasn't flipping over itself. A swim sounds delightful. I didn't allow myself room for second guessing, and I took no small amount of pride in the fact that my fingers didn't tremble once as I removed my boots, then unbuttoned my tunic and pants, and shucked them onto the grass. My undergarments were modest enough that I wasn't showing much, but I still looked straight at him as I stood on my grassy bank, and the air was warm and mild, and a soft breeze kissed its way across my bare stomach. Slowly, so slowly, his eyes moved down and then up, as if he were studying every inch, every curve of me. And even though I wore my ivory under things, that gaze alone stripped me bare. His eyes met mine, and he gave me a lazy smile before removing his clothes, button by button. I could have sworn the gleam in his eyes turned hungry and feral, enough so that I had to look anywhere but his face. I let myself indulge in the glimpse of a broad chest, arms corded with muscle, and long, strong legs before I walked into that pool. He wasn't built like Isaac, whose body had very much still been in the gangly place between boy and man. No, Tomlin's glorious body was honed by centuries of fighting and brutality. The liquid was delightfully warm, and I strode in until it was deep enough to swim out of a few strokes and casually tread in place. Not water, but something smoother, thicker. Not oil, but something pure, thinner. Like being wrapped in warm silk. I was so busy savoring the tug of my fingers through this silvery substance that I didn't notice him until he was treading beside me. Who taught you how to swim? He said, and dunked his head under the surface. When he came up, he was grinning, sparkling streams of starlight running across the contours of his mask. I didn't go under. Didn't quite know if he'd been joking about the water making me mirthful if I drank it. When I was 12, I watched the village children swimming in a pond, and I figured it out myself. It had been one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and I'd swallowed half the pond in the process. But I got the gist of it, managed to conquer the blind panic and terror and trust myself. Knowing how to swim had seemed like a vital ability. One that might someday mean the difference between life and death. I never expected it would lead to this, though. He went under again, and when he emerged, he ran a hand through his golden hair. How did your father lose his fortune? How'd you know about that? Tomlin snorted. I don't think born peasants have your kind of diction. Some part of me wanted to come up with a comment about snobbery, but, well, he was right, and I couldn't blame him for being a skilled observer. My father was called the Prince of Merchants, I said, plainly treading that silky, strange water. I hardly had to put any effort into it. The water was so warm, so light, that it felt as if I was floating in air, every ache in my body oozing away into nothing. But that title, which he inherited from his father, and his father before that, was a lie. We were just a good name that masked 3 generations of bad debt. My father had been trying to find a way to ease those debt for years, and when he had been trying to find a way to ease the... And when he found an opportunity to pay them off, he took it, regardless of the risks. I swallowed. 8 years ago, he amassed our wealth on 3 ships to sail to Barrett's for invaluable spices and cloth. Tomlin frowned. Risky indeed. Those waters are a death trap unless you go the long way. Well, he didn't go the long way. It would have taken too much time, and our creditors were breathing down his neck, so he risked sending the ships directly to Barrett. They never reached Barrett shores. I tipped my hair back in the water, clearing the memory of my father's face the day the news arrived of the sinking. When the ship sank, the creditors circled him like wolves. They ripped him apart until there was nothing left of him but a broken name and a few gold pieces to purchase that cottage. I was 11. My father, he just stopped trying after that. I couldn't bring myself to mention that final ugly moment when that other creditor had come with his cronies to wreck my father's leg. And that's when he started hunting? No. Even though we moved to the cottage, it took almost 3 years for the money to entirely run out, I said. I started hunting when I was 14. His eyes twinkled, no trace of the warrior forced to accept the High Lord's burden. And here you are. What else did you figure out for yourself? Maybe it was the enchanted pool, or maybe it was the genuine interest behind the question, but I smiled and told him about those years in the woods. Tired but surprisingly content from a few hours of swimming and eating and lounging in the glen, I eyed Lucian as we rode back to the manor that afternoon. We were crossing a broad meadow and a new spring grass when he caught me glancing at him for the 10th time, and I braced myself as he fell back from Tomlin's side. The metal eye narrowed on me while the other remained wary. Unimpressed? Yes. That was enough to persuade me not to say anything about his past. I would hate pity too, and he didn't know me, not well enough to warrant anything but resentment if I brought it up, even if it weighed on me to know it, to grieve for him. I waited until Tomlin was far enough ahead that even his high fae hearing might not pick up on my words. I never got to thank you for your advice with the cereal. Lucian tensed. Oh? I looked ahead at the easy way Tomlin rode, the horse utterly unbothered by his mighty rider. If you still want me dead, I said, you might want to try a bit harder. Lucian loosed a breath. That's not what I intended. I gave him a long look. I wouldn't shed any tears, he admitted. I knew it was true. But what happened to you? I was joking, I said, gave him a little smile. You can't possibly forgive me that easily for sending you into danger. No. And part of me would like nothing more than to wallop you for your lack of warning about the cereal, but I understand. I'm a human who killed your friend, who now lives in your house, and you have to deal with me. I understand, I said again. Wow, Farrah's being oddly understanding. These last 2 chapters, Farrah's actually acting correctly, I think. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wouldn't reply. Just as I was about to move ahead, he spoke. Tom told me that your first shot was to save the cereal's life, not your own. It seemed like the right thing to do. The look he gave me was more contemplative than any look he'd given me before. I know far too many high fae and less fairies who wouldn't have seen it that way, or bothered. He reached for something at his side and tossed it to me. I had to fight to stay in the saddle as I fumbled for it. A jeweled hunting knife. I heard your scream, he said as I examined the blade in my hands. I never held one so finely crafted, so perfectly balanced. And I hesitated. Not long, but I hesitated before I came running. Even though Tom had gotten there in time, I still broke my word in those seconds I awaited. He jerked his chin at his knife. It's yours. Don't bury it in the back, please. Or don't bury it in my back, please. All right, chapter 18 done. We're now on chapter 19. She's getting so much better. Yeah, I agree. Hello, Jollz. What's going on? We're reading a book. Aquatar. Yeah, no, I've been liking these last couple chapters. It's a good one. It's good character building, I think, for Farrah. We love character development. True. Okay. We'll read one more chapter, I think. The next morning, my paint and supplies arrived from wherever Tomlin or the servants had dug them up. But before Tomlin let me see them, he brought me down the hall after Before Tomlin let me see them, he brought me down hall after hall until we were in the wing of the house I'd never been to. Even in my nocturnal exploring, I knew where we were going without him having to say so. The marble floors shone so bright that they had to have been freshly mopped, and that rose-scented breeze floating in through the open windows, he did all this for me, as if I would have cared about cobwebs or dust. When he paused before a set of wooden doors, the slight smile he gave me was enough to make me blurt, "Why do anything this kind?" The smile faltered. "It's been a long time since there was anyone here who appreciated these things. I like seeing them used again, especially when there was such blood and death in every other part of his life." He opened the gallery doors, and the breath was knocked from me. The pale wooden floors gleamed in the clean, bright light pouring from the windows. The room was empty, save for a few large chairs and benches for viewing I barely registered moving into the long gallery, one hand absently-mindedly wrapping around my throat as I looked up at the paintings. So many, so different, yet all arranged to flow together seamlessly. Such different views and snippets and angles of the world, pastorals, portraits, still lifes, each a story and an experience, each a voice shouting or whispering or singing about the moments, the feeling had been like each a cry into the void of time that they had been there, had existed. Some had been painted through eyes like mine, artists who saw in colors and shapes I understood. Some showcased colors I had not considered. These had been to the world that told me a different set of eyes had painted them. A portrait into the mind of a creature so unlike me, and yet I looked at its work and understood and felt and cared. "I never knew," Tomlin said from behind, "that humans were capable of..." He trailed off as I turned, the hand I put on my throat sliding down to my chest, where my heart roared with a fierce sort of joy and grief, and overwhelming humility. Humility before that magnificent art. He stood by the doors, head cocked in that animalistic way, the words still lost on his tongue. I wiped at my damp cheeks. "It's perfect, wonderful, beyond my wildest imaginings." Didn't cover it. I kept my hand over my heart. "Thank you," I said. It was all I could find to show him that what these paintings to be allowed in this room meant. "Come here whenever you want." I smiled at him, hardly able to confirm or contain the brightness of my heart. His returning smile was tentative but shining, and then he left me to admire the gallery at my own leisure. I stayed for hours, stayed until I was drunk on the arts, until I was dizzy with hunger, and wandered out to find food. After lunch, Alice showed me to an empty room on the first floor with a table full of canvases of various sizes, brushes whose wooden handles gleamed into the perfect clear light, and paints. So many paints, beyond the 4 basic ones I'd hoped for, that the breath was knocked from me again. And when Alice was gone and the room was quiet and waiting and utterly mine, then I began to paint. Weeks passed, the days melting together. I painted and painted, most of it awful and useless. I never let anyone see it, no matter how much Tomlin prodded, and Lucian smirked at my paint-splattered clothes. I never felt satisfied that my work matched the images burning in my mind. Often I painted from dawn until dusk, sometimes in that room, sometimes out in the garden. Occasionally I'd take a break to explore the spring lands with Tomlin as my guide, coming back with fresh ideas that had me leaping out of bed the next morning to sketch or scribble down the scenes or colors as I glimpsed at them. But there were days when Tomlin was called away to face the latest threat to his borders, and even painting couldn't distract me until he returned, covered in blood that wasn't his own. Sometimes in his beast form, sometimes as the High Lord. He never gave me details, and I didn't presume to ask about them. His safe return was enough. Around the manor itself, there were no signs of creatures like the Naga or the other bog, but I stayed well away from the western woods, even though I painted them often enough from memory. And though my dreams continued to be plagued by the deaths I witnessed, the deaths I caused, and that horrible pale woman ripping me to shreds, all watched over by a shadow I could never quite glimpse, I slowly stopped being so afraid. Stay with the High Lord. You'll be safe. And so I did. The spring court was a land of rolling green hills and lush forests and clear, bottomless lakes. Magic didn't just abound in the bumps and the hollows. It grew there. Try as I might to paint it, I could never capture it, the feel of it. So sometimes I dared to paint the High Lord, who rode at my side when we wandered his grounds on lazy days, the High Lord, whom I was happy to talk to or spend hours in comfortable silence with. It was probably the lulling of magic that clouded my thoughts, and I didn't think of my family until I passed the outer hedge wall one morning, scouting for a new spot to paint. A breeze from the south ruffled my hair, fresh and warm. Spring was now dawning on the mortal world. My family, glamored, cared for, safe, still had no idea where I was. The mortal world, it had moved on without me, as if I'd never existed. A whisper of miserable life, gone, unremembered by anyone whom I'd known or cared for. I didn't paint, nor did I go riding with Tomlin that day. Instead, I sat before a blank canvas, no colors at all in mind. No one would remember me back home. I was as good as dead to them, and Tomlin had let me forget them. Maybe the paints had never been a distraction, a way to get me to stop complaining, to stop being a pain in his ass about wanting to see my family. Or maybe they were a distraction from whatever was happening with the Blight and the Prythian. I'd stop asking, just as the cereal had ordered, like a stupid, useless, obedient human. It was an effort of stubborn will to make it through dinner. Tomlin and Lucian noticed my mood and kept conversation between themselves. It didn't do much for my growing rage, and when I had enough of my fill, I stalked into the moonlight garden and lost myself in the labyrinth of hedges and flower beds. I didn't care where I was going. After a while, I paused in the rose garden. The moonlight stained the red petals a deep purple and cast a silvery sheen on the white blossoms. My father had this garden planted for my mother, Tomlin said, from behind me. I didn't bother to face him. I dug my nails into my palms as he stopped by my side. It was a mating present. I stared at the flowers without seeing anything. The flowers I painted on the table at home were probably crumbled or gone by now. Nesta might have scraped them off. My nails pricked the skin of my palms. Tomlin providing for them or no, glamoring their memories or no. I'd been erased from their lives, forgotten. I let him erase me. He offered me paints and the space and time to practice. He'd shown me pools of starlight. He saved my life like some kind of feral knight in a legend, and I gulped it down like fairy wine. I was no better than those zealot children of the blessed. His mask was bronze in the darkness, and the emeralds glittered. You seem upset. I stalked to the nearest rose bush and ripped off a rose, my fingers tearing on the thorns. I ignored the pain, the warmth of the blood that trickled down. I could never paint it accurately, never render it the way those artists had in the gallery pieces. I would never be able to paint Elaine's little garden outside the cottage the way I remembered it, even if my family didn't remember me. He didn't reprimand me for taking one of his parents' roses, parents who were absent as my own, but who had probably loved each other and loved him better than mine cared for me. A family that would have offered to go in his place if someone had come and steal him away. My fingers stung and ached, but I still held on to the rose, as I said. I don't know why I feel so tremendously ashamed of myself for leaving them, why I feel so selfish and horrible to paint. I shouldn't feel this way, should I? I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it. The rose hung limply from my finger. All those years, what I did for them, and they didn't try to stop me from taking me. There it was, the giant pain that cracked me in two if I thought about it too long. I don't know why I expected them to, why I believed that the Puka's illusion was real that night. I don't know why I bothered to still think about it, or still caring. He was silent long enough that I added, compared to you, to your borders and magic being weakened, I suppose my self-pity is absurd. If it grieves you, he said, the words caressing my bones, then I don't think it's absurd at all. Why? Flat question, and I chucked the rose into the bushes. He took my hands, his calloused fingers, strong and sturdy, were gentle as he lifted my bleeding hand to his mouth and kissed my palm. As if that were an answer enough, his lips were smooth against my skin, his breath warm and my knees buckled as he lifted my other hand on his mouth and kissed it too. Kissed it carefully, in a way that made heat begin pounding in my core, between my legs. When he withdrew, my blood shone on his mouth. I glanced at my hands, which he still held, and found the wounds gone. I looked at his face again, as his gilded mask, the tains of his eye, or the tanness of his skin, the red of his blood-covered lips as he murmured, "Don't feel bad for one moment about doing what brings you joy." He stepped closer, releasing one of my hands to tuck the rose I plucked behind my ear. I didn't know how it had gotten into his hand, or where the thorns had gone. I couldn't stop myself from pushing. Why do any of this? He leaned in closer, so close that I had to tip my head back to see him. Because your human joy fascinates me. The way you experience things in your lifespan so wildly and deeply and all at once is entrancing. I'm drawn to it, even when I know I shouldn't be, even when I try not to be. Because I was human and I would grow old and I didn't let myself get that far, as he came closer still, slowly, as if I'm giving me time to pull away, he brushed his lips against my cheek, soft and warm, heartbreakingly gentle. It was hardly more than a caress before he straightened. I hadn't moved from the moment his mouth had met my skin. One day there'll be answers for everything, he said, releasing my hand and stepping away. But not until the time is right, until it's safe. In the dark, his tone was enough to know that his eyes were flecked with bitterness. He left me, and I took a gasping breath, not realizing I'd been holding it, not realizing that I craved his warmth, his nearness, until he was gone. Lingering mortification over what I'd admired, what had changed between us, had me skulking out of the manor after breakfast, fleeing for the sanctuary of the woods for some fresh air, and to study the light and colors. I brought my bow and arrows, along with the jeweled hunting knife that Lucian had given me. Better to be armed than caught empty-handed. I crept through the trees and brushed for no more than an hour before I felt a presence behind me, coming even closer, sending the animals running for cover. I smiled to myself, and 20 minutes later, I settled in the crook of a towering elm and waited. Brush rustled, hardly more than a breeze passing, but I knew what to expect, knew the signs. A snap and roar of fury echoed across the lands, scattering the birds. When I climbed to the tree and walked into the little clearing, I merely crossed my arms and looked up at the High Lord, dangling by his legs from the snare I'd laid. Even upside down, he smiled lazily at me as I approached. Cruel human. That's what you get for stalking someone, he chuckled. And I came close enough to dare stroke a finger along the silken golden hair dangling just above my face, admiring the many colors within it, the hues of yellow, brown, and wheat. My heart thundered, and I knew he could probably hear it, but he leaned his head towards me, a silent invitation, and I ran my fingers through his hair, gently, carefully. He purred, the sound rumbling through my fingers, arms, legs, and core. I wonder how that sound would feel if he were fully pressed up against me, skin to skin. I stepped back. He curled upward in a smooth, powerful motion and swiped with a single claw at the creeping vine I'd used for a rope. I took a breath to shout, but he flipped as he fell, landing smoothly on his feet. It would be impossible for me to even forget what he was and what he was capable of. He took a step closer to me, the laughter still dancing on his face. "Feeling better today," I mumbled. Soon. Non-committable response. "Good," he said, either ignoring or hiding his amusement. "But just in case, I wanted to give you this," he added, pulling some papers from his tunic and extending them to me. I bit the inside of my cheek as I stared down at the 3 pieces of paper. It was a series of 5-lined poems. There were 5 of them altogether. And I began sweating at words I didn't recognize. It would take me an entire day just to figure out what these words meant. "Before you bolt or start yelling," he said, coming around to peer over my shoulder. If I dared, I could have leaned back into his chest. His breath warmed my neck, the shell of my ear. He cleared his throat and read the first poem. "There once was a lady most beautiful, spirited, if a little unusual. Her friends were few, but how the men did queue. But to all she gave a refusal." My brows rose so high, I thought they'd touch my hairline, and I turned, blinking at him, our breath mingling as he finished the poem with a smile. Without waiting for my response, Tomlin took the papers and stepped a pace away to read the second poem. which wasn't nearly as polite as the first. By the time he read the third poem, my face was burning. Tomlin paused before he started the fourth, then handed me back the papers. Final word in the second and fourth line of each poem, he said, jerking his chin towards the papers in my hands. Unusual. Q. I looked at the second poem, slaying, conflagration. These are, I started. Your list of words was too interesting to pass up, and not good for love poems at all. When I lifted my brow in silent inquiry, he said, we had contests to see who would write the dirtiest limericks while I was living with my father's war band by the border. I don't particularly enjoy losing, so I took it upon myself to become good at them. I didn't know how he'd remember that long list I compiled. I didn't want to, sensing I was about to draw an arrow and shoot him. Tomlin took the papers and read the fifth poem, the dirtiest and foulest of them all. When he finished, I tipped back my head and howled, my laughter like sunshine shattering age-hardened ice. I was still smiling when he walked out of the park and towards the rolling hills, meandering back to the manor. You said that night in the rose garden, I sucked on my teeth for a moment, you said that your father had it planned for your parents upon their mating, not wedding. Had it planted for your parents upon their mating, not wedding. High fae mostly marry, he said. His golden skin flushed a bit. But if they're blessed, they'll find their mate. They're equal. Their match in every way. High fae wed without their mating bond. But if you find your mate, the bond is so deep that marriage is insignificant in comparison. I didn't have the nerve to ask if fairies had ever had mating bonds with humans, but instead dared to say, where are your parents? What happened to them? A muscle feathered in his jaw, and I regretted the question, if only for the pain that flickered in his eyes. My father, his claw gleamed at his knuckles, but didn't go out any further. I definitely asked the wrong question. My father was as bad as Lucian's, worse. My two older brothers were just like him. They kept slaves, all of them, and my brothers, I was younger when the treaty was forged, but I still remember what my brothers used to, he trailed off. It left a mark. Enough of a mark that when I saw you, your house, I wouldn't let myself be like them. Wouldn't bring harm to your family or you, or subject you to fairy whims. Slaves. There had been slaves here. I didn't want to know. I never looked for traces of them. Even 500 years later, I was still little better than chattel to most of his people, his world. That was why he'd offered the loophole, why he offered me the freedom to live wherever I wanted in Prithian. Thank you, I said. He shrugged as if that would dismiss his kindness, the weight of the guilt that still bore down on him. What about your mother? Tomlin loosed a breath. My mother, she loved my father deeply, too deeply, but they were mated. And even if she saw what a tyrant he was, she wouldn't say an ill word against him. I never expected, never wanted my father's title. My brothers would have never let me live to adolescence if they had suspected that I did. So the moment I was old enough, I joined my father's war band and trained so that I might someday deserve or serve my father, or whichever of my brothers inherited the title. He flexed his hands as if imagining the claws beneath. I'd realized from an early age that fighting and killing were about the only thing I was good at. I doubt that, I said. He gave me a wry smile. Oh, and I could play a mean fiddle, but High Lords' sons don't become traveling minstrels. So I trained and fought for my father against whomever he told me to fight, and I would have been happy to leave the scheming to my brothers. But my power kept growing, and I couldn't hide it, not among our kind. He shook his head. Fortunately or unfortunately, they were all killed by the High Lord of an enemy court. I was spared for whatever reason, or Cauldron granted luck. My mother, I mourned. The others, a tight shrug. My brothers would not have tried to save me from a fate like yours. I looked up at him. Such a brutal, harsh world, with families killing each other for power, for revenge, for spite and control. Perhaps his generosity, his kindness, was a reaction to that. Perhaps he'd seen me and found it to be like gazing into a mirror of sorts. I'm sorry about your mother, I said, and it was all I could offer, all he'd once been able to offer me. He gave me a small smile, So that's how you became High Lord. Most High Lords are trained from birth in manners and laws and court warfare. When the title fell to me, it was a rough transition. Many of my father's courtiers defected to other courts rather than having a warrior-based beast snarling at them. A half-wild beast, Nesta once called me. It was an effort to not take his hand, to not reach out to him and tell him that I understood, but I just said, then they're idiots. You've kept these lands protected from the blight, when it seems that others haven't fared so well. They're idiots, I said again. But darkness flickered in Tomlin's eyes, and his shoulders seemed to curve inward ever so slightly. Before I could ask about it, we cleared the little wood. A spread of hills and knolls lay down ahead in the distance. There were masked fairies atop of many of them, building what seemed to be unlit fires. What are those? I asked, halting. They're setting up bonfires for Kalanme. It's in 2 days. For what? Fire night? I shook my head. We don't celebrate holidays in the human realm. Not after your people left. In some places it's forbidden. We don't even remember the name of your gods. What does Kala Fire Night celebrate? He rubbed his neck. It's just the spring ceremony. We light bonfires, and the magic that we create help regenerate the land for the year ahead. How do you create the magic? There's a ritual, but it's very fairy. He clenched his jaw and continued walking away from the unlit fires. You might see more fairies around than usual, fairies from this court and from other territories, who are free to wander across the borders that night. I thought the blight had scared many of them away. It has, but there will be a number of them. Just stay away from them all. You'll be safe in the house, but if you run into one before we light the fires at sundown in 2 days, ignore them. And I'm not invited to the ceremony? No, you're not. He clenched and loosened his fingers again and again, as if trying to keep the claws contained. Though I tried to ignore him, my chest caved a bit. We walked back in the sort of tense silences we hadn't endured in weeks. Tomlin went rigid the moment we entered the gardens, not from our awkward conversation. It was quiet with that horrific stillness that usually meant one of the nastier fairies was around. Tomlin bared his teeth in a low snarl. Stay hidden, and no matter what you overhear, don't come out. Then he was gone. Alone, I looked to either side of the gravel path like some gawking idiot. If there was indeed something here, I'd be caught in the open. Perhaps it was shameful not to go to his aid, but he was a High Lord. I would just get in the way. I had just ducked behind a hedge when I heard Tomlin and Lucian approaching. I silently swore and froze. Maybe I could sneak across the fields to the stables if there was a miss, but the stables not only had shelter, but also a horse for me to flee on. I was about to make for the high grasses. Mere steps beyond the edge of the garden, when Tomlin's snarl ripped through the air on the other side of the hedge. I turned, just enough to spy them through the dense leaves. Stay hidden, he said. If I moved now, I would surely be noticed. I know what day it is, Tomlin said, but not the solution. Rather, the two of them faced nothing. Someone who wasn't there. Someone invisible. I would have thought they were playing a prank on me had I not heard a low, disembodied voice reply. Your continued behavior is garnering a lot of interest at court, the voice said, deep and sibilant. I shivered. Despite the warmth of the day, she has begun wandering why you haven't given up yet, and why Four Naga wound up dead not too long ago. Tomlin, not like the other fools. Lucian snapped, his shoulders pushed back to raise himself to his full height, more warrior-like than I'd ever seen him. No wonder he had all these weapons in his room. If she expected bowed heads, then she's more of an idiot than I thought, the voice hissed, and my blood went cold at the noise. Speak you so ill of she who holds your fate in her hands? With one word, she could destroy this pathetic estate. She wasn't pleased when she heard of your dispatching your warriors. The voice now seemed turned toward Tomlin, but as nothing has come of it, she has chosen to ignore it. There was a deep throat snarl from the High Lord, but his words were calm as he said, Tell her I'm getting sick of cleaning up the trash she dumps on my borders. the voice chuckled, the sound like sand shifting. She sets them loose as gifts and reminders of what will happen if she catches you trying to break the terms of he's not, Lucian snarled. Now get out. We have enough of your ilk swarming on the borders. We don't need you defiling our home, too. For that matter, stay the hell out of the cave. It's not some common road for filth like you to travel through as they please. Tomlin loosed a growl of agreement. The invisible thing laughed again, such a horrible, vicious sound. Though you have a heart of stone, Tomlin, it said, and Tomlin went rigid. You certainly keep a host of fear inside it, the voice sank into a croon. Don't worry, High Lord. It spat the title like a joke. All will be right as rain soon enough. Burn in hell, Lucian replied for Tomlin, and the thing laughed again before a flap of leathery wings boomed, a foul wind bit my face, and everything went silent. They breathed deeply after another moment. I closed my eyes, deepening a steadying breath as well, but massive hands clamped onto my shoulders and I yelped. It's gone, Tomlin said, releasing me. It was all I could do not to sag against the hedges. What did you hear? Tomlin demanded, coming around the corner and crossing his arms. I shifted my gaze to Tomlin's face, but found it to be so white with anger at that thing, that I had to look again at Lucian. Nothing I understood, I said and meant it. None of it made sense. I couldn't stop shaking. Something about that voice had ripped away the warmth from me. What was that? Tomlin began pacing, the gravel churning beneath his foot. There are certain fairies in Prithian who inspired the legend that humans are so afraid of. Some, like that one, are myth-given flesh. Inside that hissing voice, I heard the screaming of human victims, the pleading of young maidens whose chests had been split open on sacrificial altars, mentions of court seemingly different from Tomlin's own. Was that she the one who killed Tomlin's parents? A high lady, perhaps, in lieu of the Lord? Considering how ruthless the High Fae were to their families, they had to be nightmarish to their enemies. And if there was to be a warring between the courts, if the blight had left Tomlin already weakened, if the Ator saw her, Lucian said, gleaming around. It didn't, Tomlin said. Are you certain it didn't? Tomlin growled over his shoulder, then looked at me, his face still pale with fury, lips tight. I'll see you at dinner. Understanding a dismissal and craving the locked door of my bedroom, I trudged back to the house, contemplating who this she was to make Tomlin and Lucian so nervous and to command that thing as her messenger. The spring breeze whispered that I didn't want to know. All right. Chapter 19 done. We're on chapter 20. That was good. That was a good chapter. Lots of stuff is starting to happen. Lots of stuff are starting to pick up. It was good. It was good.